All right. Hey, everyone. So, I know this was covered on at least Walsh's stream, but I wanted to talk about it because I feel like it's kind of a big deal. So, let's look into this. This is from theocratic fascist Matt Walsh, and he is talking about this post, which I already read to chat, so they'll have to bear with me, but so everybody who's watching the video after, the number of kids who identify as LGBT, especially trans and bisexual, has absolutely skyrocketed. If you think this is a natural or organic development, you're deluded. The media, Hollywood, and the school system actively recruit children into LGBT ranks. So think about that for a second. Let's think critically about this. What do we know about these demographics? Right? Like, let's see. So Gen X, when they were 20-somethings, had the lesbian Avengers in the 90s and the big shift of lesbians being super cool. By the way, I'm eating soup right now, so just bear with me. Trans people were almost never heard of unless you're talking about movies. By the way, if you want to see a fantastic takedown of trans representation in media and how awful it was, look at Lindsay Ellis's video about this. It recently came out and it's pretty damn good. So Gen X, by its nature, didn't have really any real representation for trans people other than horrific monsters, or, you know, gay and lesbian people, and maybe if you were lucky towards the end of the 90s, you had like a bi character, but kinda, sorta. Millennials, people like me, born in 81, you see an explosion. Holy shit, look at all these people. What do millennials have in common? Well, beyond just age, we have things like we started seeing representation of LGBT identities in media. So there were things like the L word, there were things like trans representation in, and granted, some of these were awful, but they were still there. There's a really problematic one in Sex and the City in the early 2000s that sort of depicts these sex workers in a really sort of weirdly positive light, and it keeps trying, but then they say something stupid. It's not good, but it's interesting because it frames the situation not as bad. You can even look at movies from earlier in the 90s starting to push this with the idea of drag queens, right? Like, Tu Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Truly Noir is... Oh, and Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, of course. Are sort of pushing the envelope on queer stuff a little bit. And I wonder if that's also what started pushing this idea that we want to have these kinds of representation. And obviously activism was a huge part of this. But the reason I'm bringing this up is notice that once we get to Gen Z, these damnable Zoomers, a lot of bisexual Zoomers, fairly consistent gay, fairly increasing lesbians, despite what every fucking TERF has ever said. And number of transgender people has increased, though not spectacularly high. And then, of course, others such as Ace, and Ace, Demi, Pan, etc. Although, arguably, depending on who is talking, people may either think bi and pan are the same thing or not, so there could be some conflation there. But what I think is really important to like recognize in this piece that he posted is that he's taking this as being some sort of indoctrination, that we're trying to somehow take children and like convert them to LGBT. Like, oh, little girl, maybe you don't want to be a girl. Maybe you want to be a boy. That's one idea. The idea I would have is that I would assume two things. One, as each generation has gone on, and you can see this in their behavior, there is a way in which their behavior has led to continued opening and more post-conventional critique of the previous generation. Gen X was already irritated and bothered by the boomers. They bought into it originally. A lot of the early Gen X folks, I would argue, aren't really differentiated from the boomers, at least as far as values and the like. Though a lot of the later Gen Xers, I would say, that starts to change. You see things like in... My God, look at the Seattle music scene, look at like Beavis and Butthead. Like there's a way that like disaffected youth was kind of the thing. Very disenchanted with systems, very much that. By the time you get to millennials, you're talking about kids that literally watched Reaganomics. You literally watched like the AIDS crisis destroy, you know, hundreds of thousands of lives, millions of lives. And then, like, there's also, like, yes, Elizabeth. Oh, right. Fuck this guy with a rusty girder in Minecraft. You're not going to fuck with TOS. In Minecraft. We would not wish any harm or pain to this gentleman. We want him to have a healthy, fruitful life and to come to his own awakening to understanding that LGBT identities are good and that his beliefs are bad. Moving on. So my thought here is actually that there's two phenomenon happening here. One is, through activism, openness has become more safe. I would say that if you're asking people to self-identify, and you're asking them in the 1950s to identify themselves as bi, you're on fucking drugs. Because, and this is the big part, essentially what happens is that if... Fair, Elizabeth, fair. I support you in your journey. Right? So, however that happens, we don't want any harm, but should he accidentally get fucked by a rusty girder in Minecraft, no one is going to be upset. So my point here is this, and I think this is an important thing to look at, is that, to me, this is progress. This is the work of activists making the world safer for queer identities. And I would argue that not only is this a good thing because people are more self-identifying, I would argue that at least to some degree, it's arguable, depending on what the source of this data is, and I can try to look it up, but either two things could be happening. One, through the effects of activism and representation, more people have stopped to consider that there are other alternatives. If you're a AMAP person who is, you know, identified as a guy and struggled with all sorts of issues, and you just have these dreams about being a girl, and they're really important to you, and you know, you play female characters in D&D, you do all these things, and then you see trans representation in Orange is the New Black. Laverne Cox, the beautiful Laverne Cox, just is on the screen, and absolutely a woman in every conceivable sense of the word. That's interesting. Because now an opportunity, right? An alternative has come about. And so I would argue that these conservatives that say this nonsense, this is where things get really stupid, because these people argue that they want liberty, but they refuse to give it to anybody else. They want to be hateful, they want to be aggressive, but by all rights, looking at these numbers, this should be a good thing. People are being more open and honest with who they are. And that's where I think that it's important to look at these numbers. Now, he's posted them from Gallup. Let's take a look at Gallup. All right, I don't need that on. There we go. See Gallup latest update on lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender identities. Hi. Cool. Super cool. Okay. Nah, we'll get them, don't worry. 86% of you. So, I know Kinsey is kind of like problematic because Kinsey tends to be a, how do I explain Kinsey? Short version, Kinsey was a researcher who did very cutting-edge research on sexuality, and inadvertently figured out some of his own sexuality. And the really important thing to recognize here is what is called the Kinsey scale. Let me see if I can grab us a version of that, because I think this actually is going to account for... I can't even spell today. What the hell's wrong with me? There we go. So, is this going to have an image, or am I going to have to... This is... Oh yeah, this'll do. This'll do. So, here's the Kinsey scale. Kinsey spoke to a shit ton of people during, I want to say it was like the 1940s or 50s, give or take. Yeah, that's what I'm looking at. And what he came up with is that the people he spoke to, he saw this. He saw that there is, to some degree, these two types of sexualities at either end of the spectrum. There is obviously exclusively heterosexual and exclusively homosexual. What he pointed out was that there are these 5 other identities that are there. 3 being equally both heterosexual and homosexual. And then obviously mixtures therein, right? So like 5 being predominantly homosexual, but only incidentally heterosexual. Like if you're a lesbian and you're like, no, I really like women. But there was this one guy in college who I really liked and I fucked and that was really great. But yeah, it's mostly women. In fact, that was actually my partner's experience with me. My partner had identified as a lesbian and got some shit from her friends because I hadn't been out yet. And the joke, of course, is that, you know, we were sort of under the impression then that they were sort of Kinsey 5, and that's why they were, you know, why they were okay with me. But the reality of the situation is that they probably could still go that way based on some history. But like, look at, but obviously I'm a woman, so it still falls in that, you know, category. But the point I'm sort of trying to get to is that I want to point out that the conservative framing around this stuff doesn't make any fucking sense. If you look at the numbers that he suggests, there isn't really much of a huge increase in gay men. Okay. Lesbians increase, which could arguably be more about the lack of rigidity around the feminine identity, feminine role. So there could be a way in which, because women may be able to feel more open and free to be able to discuss who they are and how they are, and there's been a lot of efforts to make lesbianism more mainstream since the 90s and on, I would guess that's probably what's to blame for this, is that to some degree this is good. This is an increase, and that I would suggest is probably have to do with more with rigidity as well. The big one that, and this is obviously the one that the conservatives are pissed about, are this one and this one, bisexuals and transgender, just like Matt said. The biggest issue here is that I can tell that explosion is not just because Hollywood's trying to indoctrinate people, it's because of fucking representation, and it's also because of fucking Kinsey. If more people feel open to be able to come out and don't feel like it's going to lean to something terrible, right, then by definition, what's going to happen is that they're going to be able to show up somewhere in here. And if someone is, whether someone identifies as pan or bi or whatnot, I don't know if the article itself specifies, but even if we just assume bi, there's a lot of people who do things like experiment in college. There's a lot of people who do things where they, you know, they work to, you know, try new things or interact in certain ways. Like poly communities have this happen a lot, where like previously heterosexual identities may start engaging more in bisexual identities. Though in my experience, this tends to happen more with women than men, but there's a really good book called The Polyamorous Next Door. It covers a lot of this stuff from a lady's dissertation. It's a bit dry, but it's good. But I think the thing that we really have to take into consideration here is that these numbers are not because of some awful cabal trying to convert children. It's because people feel safe and because representation matters. If a kid can watch She-Ra and see Adora kiss Catra, right? Like, She-Ra, Adora, kiss Catra. I want to make sure that's yeah, this happened in this show. Look at that. It's amazing. I love both of them so much. Also, Catra is like the avatar of BPD, in my opinion. She just makes more sense. Also, whoever drew this, you're an amazing human being. Anyway. So, the big point here is that I want to point out that these numbers are easy to understand when you understand how sociology, or understand, and I'm not saying like a sociologist. I'm not saying like bachelor's level. I mean, have taken a couple sociology courses and understand basically how population demographics work, and also how messaging changes. Like, look, if people feel more safe, people are going to be able to be out more. Look at the numbers, for example, like if you're looking at the transgender rate, same thing. Think about this. 30 years ago, if there had been a Twitter, would any of us have felt safe being out? Owl House is another great one. Hold on. We gotta talk about fucking great shows that have cute fucking children. God damn, I really wish this stuff existed when I was young. Owl House. Owl House. Dance. I can't show it because obviously they suck, but this is the thing in the Owl House. You should watch it. Look at this. Like, this happened a couple years back. Like there's so many people in the queer community that just love this. Like, they're pretty sure this character Amity is lesbian. They're pretty sure that Luce is bisexual. I think that was actually like said directly, and there are some based on like, yes, hoot hoot. But yeah, like there's even some that have said maybe they might be non-binary, so that could be a thing, right? So like, the reason I'm sort of laboriously trying to bring this shit up is because I want it to be understood that when conservatives say these things, they're not based on actual numbers. They're based on framing simple data points in a certain direction to create a narrative. But if you have even brain one, you can look at this narrative and go, this doesn't make any sense. If there really was... Elizabeth, exactly, yeah. So for those who I don't have the chat up because I'm still lurking that shit out, what Elizabeth said is, I knew I was a girl in 94. I didn't feel okay with her to come to terms with it until 2019. Same. So I knew I was a girl probably through most of my teens. I knew there was something about me that didn't make sense, that I felt like there was this really strong connection to girls. And I did a lot of really, now I look back, very interesting things with some of my male friends. Holy shit. Not going to get into that here. But around 97, I worked with a queer newsletter that I was messing around with being trans. Having peers to look to and safety were key to keeping me in the class. Yeah. Yeah, especially... What do you mean by that? Do you mean that like your peers were people that unfortunately reified sort of heterosexual and cisgender narratives? Or are you saying that people were there to kind of keep you safe and stop you from like prematurely coming out? Elizabeth said having peers to look to, safety were key to keeping me in the closet. For me, it was, you know, heterosexuality, right? Like I basically like found someone, they were 3 months pregnant. I wanted to make sure a kid didn't grow up without a parent again, to give a kind of insight into my psychology. And now I have an almost 21-year-old, and their mom passed away some time ago. So like we're fine. Don't get it twisted, but yeah. But this is the thing, like I didn't feel comfortable and didn't even think it was really safe enough for me to do so until probably like yep, not having trans people in the public view. Yeah, like suddenly seeing trans people coming out. Like I'll admit this, like again, my transition was because of Natalie Wynn. Like I realized Natalie's not everyone's cup of tea. I know there's a lot of concern in the trans community about whether, you know, she's great, she's terrible, whatever. I don't want to get into that. I really like ContraPoints, so I'll just say that. But I'm not here to argue with anyone about that. I think her videos can be very, very helpful, especially with newly out people. And I've used them for sessions, actually. The point I'm trying to get to is seeing an out trans woman who spoke so directly, so incredibly openly about her transness, and doing so during the Trump administration was something that was really great. And it's something that gave me the courage to come forward. That and being called out by queer communities for not understanding what they were going through. Those two things together really pushed me forward. And I can imagine as more people who are queer, publicly queer, right? Like Elizabeth says here, all I saw was monsters in the media and talk show circuses. Yeah. Yeah. Like, if that's all you fucking see, then what happens is that you think this is a terrible thing to come out as. That's my peripheral whole view on, your parental whole view on trans people. Yeah, because they're going by something. I'm going to put this in the chat. Give me 1 second. I'm going to go... Jesus, where is it? All right, let's go here. Let's go to Lindsay Ellis. Actually, we're just going to go to just youtube.com. I have that there because I wanted to check to make sure the stream was working. Let's see here. Lindsay Ellis. That's not how you spell Lindsay. Okay. So I'm not going to watch this on air because obviously I don't want to steal people's fucking shit. But, like, let's just be super clear. This video right here, Tracing the Roots of Pop Culture Transphobia, there's a reason for that. I'll do a very short version of this, but essentially what Lindsay points out is that after Ed Gein, the serial killer, was found to have the bodies of women turned into, by the way, content warning on horrific things, content warning on trauma. I'm not going to go into details. I just want to let you know I'm going to be talking about kind of rough stuff, and I'm not going to stay on it too long. So content warning on that. She talks about the fact that Ed Gein had killed a couple women. He'd also made, out of women from the cemetery, he had used their bodies to make various furniture. Really, really nasty stuff. Watch the video. It gives way more detail and also explains some of that stuff. But it was right around the same time that Ed Gein was a thing, who was, like, wanting to sort of be a woman or wanting to have, like, the aesthetic of a woman. Like, it was really hard to tell. But, like, yup, Ace Ventura. Funky Thoughts, same fucking thing here. Ace Ventura. So Funky Thoughts just said, yup, same. Ace Ventura came out when I was 14. Same here. I was right around that age, too. And that movie fucked me up. And by the way, going back and looking at that, anyone that's tried tucking, just as a side note, anyone that goes back and looks at that and sees, like, the tucking they're trying to point out, it doesn't physically work. Like, you would have to be made out of that same material that, like, a Stretch Armstrong's made out of. Like, it looks like they took a trans man's packer and, like, stuck it on this cis girl's butt. Like, that's the only way I can describe that scene now. Because it's just bent in such a way, it doesn't work. No one, I don't even know how to describe it. She also covers that. But yeah, Ed Gein combined with, yup. Yeah, no, it's the evil trans trope again, right? The same thing with fucking Norman Bates, who's not trans. They even go out of the way to say he's not a transvestite. He's more schizotypical. But everyone still remembers him being a person in a woman's dress killing people. The same thing's true with Buffalo Bill. She talks about this in here, where Buffalo Bill isn't a true transsexual. In fact, there's a scene in the movie that she mentions that even her own friends didn't remember, where Hannibal Lecter says something to the effect of, she's not a Buffalo Bill is not a transsexual, not in the traditional way, but he tries. And the response from Clarice is, well, we know from data that transsexuals are perfectly safe, perfectly fine people. Like, there's no problem. So, like, this is literally in there. In fact, the book itself has a scene basically really clearly trying to hammer home that Buffalo Bill is not a goddamn transsexual. He's a monster who people conflate with that. And so I really highly say watch this Lindsay Ellis video. I'll put the link in the chat. But I just have to be very clear on this, folks. Please, 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 please watch this. Just to go into the chat. Boom. So yeah, so this stuff here, sort of floating in the ether and floating in existence, comes back to this. In a lot of ways, more people are willing to come out as themselves because... That's right, that's the term. Elizabeth, you're correct. Starling says trans women are passive. You're right. She says, like, she basically says, like, we're not a danger. Like, that's the overarching thing. In fact, she, like, her and, like, Hannibal Lecter in the scene, if I remember correctly, the context is, like, they're basically, like, denying that this is what Buffalo Bill is. But no one remembers that. They remember the part where Buffalo Bill's putting on lipstick and saying, would I fuck me? Right? Like... Okay, let's guess what we're doing. And there's a number of other examples. The crying game's another example of kind of the poor response to some of the stuff. Obviously, the woman in the crying game wasn't a murderer, but there is sort of this idea that, like, there's a secret there. Again, watch Lindsay Ellis' video. It's really good. Anyway, my point with all this is really simple. You could not have a trans Twitter or trans YouTube or trans Twitch in Generation X. And not just because of technology. If we assume the technology is the same from here to then, this wouldn't have happened. You might have had more people talking, but there's nothing, like, there's a reason why the advent of the internet with more representation and more awareness, because people are now aware that these things exist, combined with overall Zoomer tendencies to be very accepting and being willing to engage with these things, because a lot of the traditional systems, including the way we look at masculine and feminine, have broken down. Like, let's be very clear. The notion of masculine and feminine were already shattering when I was a kid. When I was born in 81, a couple years later we had He-Man. Like, if that's not the most camp, like, incredibly, like, distorted variation of masculinity, I don't know what is. I mean, the same thing's true with women. Like, you were having shows like Bosom Buddies, where two men dressed up as women to live at a cheaper, I think cheaper rental, wasn't it? And then, like, Susan's Place, yep. But yeah, this is the thing. Like, I feel like there's a number of factors that come together here, and it's not because of some awful conspiracy, and of course he doesn't say who the conspiracy is from. It's the evil LGBT in Hollywood, which usually is code for either hate the gays or the Jews. I mean, let's be clear with right-leaning people. Like, half the time they're just Nazis. So, like, let's be very honest. One thing I will make very clear is there's a thing I'm working on right now, and I would like some level of feedback on this if people are interested, but I would like to do a bit of a deep dive into some of the research on people's political habits, their emotions, things like that, because I have a personal hypothesis. And my hypothesis is that people who tend towards conservative values, by definition, are less healthy than people who go towards liberal leftist ones. I also think that this can have effects on cognitive function. I feel like this could also have effects on numerous other factors. Empathy. I know there's been studies showing empathy is much lesser in libertarians. I want to point out why. I think, in some ways, I think this is a discussion to be had, is conservatism pathological? And I would argue, if it hurts others or the person, yes, that's our definition of pathology. Someone can absolutely have DID, and if it's not causing any problems for anyone, arguably that's an issue, kind of, but it's not really something that needs to be fixed. If people are going through and stealing rights and attacking the Capitol and doing all sorts of things, when do we start to ask the question, what is up with these people? Interesting discussion, but this is where I think Matt Walsh falls into it. I think that he's using this as a way to push a conservative narrative that is inherently harmful and inherently problematic and incredibly easy to see through. There is literally no reason whatsoever that anyone should be concerned about this, because what it means is, and this is the end of the day, people are being more themselves. Full stop. People are allowed to be themselves. Unless you have some nonsensical idea where you have evidence to show that these identities are harmful, which in the literature, there's a plurality of data says this isn't an issue, it's not harming anyone, being trans is perfectly valid, it is not a pathology. I mean, fuck, even transsexualism was removed from the IDC-11, or was, I can't remember, they still stuck with that, and even gender dysphoria is way different than the original transsexualism in the DSM. Elizabeth writes, wasn't there a round of research on extremists having reduced cognitive function and potential? Absolutely, Elizabeth. So, I saw this on Walsh's stream, but in it, the idea was essentially that people who tend towards certain behaviors, that is black and white thinking, lower cognition, less awareness in certain ways, tended to be people that were more easy to get into extremism and whatnot. Now, obviously, the causality of that works, I don't know. It could be that they themselves have those functions and then they lean towards conservatism, or it could be that conservatism does do that damage. I would argue that those philosophies do very real damage to people. Like I said with the libertarian thing, I loathe libertarians. I think that it's a very problematic. It's libertarians in the sort of right-leaning, sort of supposedly social progressive idea, the idea that we shouldn't have any government or taxes. That stuff I think is really silly. But they've done research on these people, and like literally they have a much lower empathy score. Which makes sense, because if you don't want anyone to have welfare or anyone to have Social Security, of course you have a lower empathy. You're incapable. So the point I want to make with this segment is this. We need to get better at vetting this data and understanding it, and I think we need to push back harder on it. I think it's incredibly important to recognize that these trends mean we are winning. LGBT identities are winning. We are coming out, we are being who we are. The fact that I can have this YouTube channel and I'm not immediately hunted with pitchforks and torches is a thing. The way we deal with this is continued representation, continued activism, and we have to break these harmful stereotypes. Trans men can't be invisible anymore, especially in media. Non-binary people cannot be the butt of the joke. They can't be attacked. They can't be treated poorly. They can't be used as a straw man to try to tear us apart. And another segment we're going to do tonight, I'm going to cover why I have some issues with some definitions of transness that's going to be long and laborious and ugh. But I think we need to be able to push back on this stuff with very real understanding, because this stuff is good. This stuff is an active good. All right? So if you like this video, please like, share, subscribe, hit the bell if you want to get notified when I put out new videos. You can also just go down into the description and you will see that you can give me a tip via Streamlabs, or you can join our Patreon. Patreon members get videos somewhat early, and we're looking to create other types of bonuses as well. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time. See ya.